We already talked about the basic appearance of objects in the previous chapters. This is the default white fill black stroke. So whenever you create an object, you will get these two attributes automatically applied, and the stroke size will be 1 point. This applies to every object. So there's a circle, there's a square, and we can also draw lines. Just simply using the line tool, I can draw a line as well. You will see that Illustrator always applies the same principle, so that black 1 point stroke on the outline of these shapes. In this video, I'm going to show you all the things that you need to know about the additional settings of strokes. First of all, let me select this circle and increase the size of the stroke. It's good to know that you can either select sizes from this drop down or use the up and down arrow, or of course you can type in a size as well. But I like to use a shortcut when I want to quickly increase the size. By holding down the shift key, clicking on these arrows, you can much faster increase the size because it's going to increase it by 10-point increments. When you change the color of the stroke, you can click here and pick a default swatch, or if you again shift click on this drop down, you actually get a different way of picking a color by using the color panel as a pop-up, in which you can pick a color based on the CMYK values that we use for print, or you can just sample a color from this area here at the bottom. And also you can switch to RGB, HSB, grayscale, or even sRGB modes. A quite interesting option also is the invert feature, with which you can invert the currently selected color. This way of picking a color, of course, applies to the fill color as well. So if I shift click on that, again, we will be able to sample easily. Or if I don't hold down the shift, I will get back to the normal selection of swatches. We can also get to additional options by either clicking here on the word stroke or finding the stroke panel here on the right. Now the stroke panel by default only shows the weight of the stroke, but if you open up the show options feature, that will actually show you exactly the same things that you would normally get up here as well. So let's walk through these now. We have an important feature called align stroke. By default, it is going to be aligned to the center, but you can align it to inside or outside of the outline of your shape. When it's set to center, it's going to be divided between inside and outside. So in my case, because it's 20 point, it will be 10 points inside, 10 points outside. There's another very useful feature called dashed line, which also helps to see how this centered alignment works. So once you turn on dashed line, you actually get a pattern on the stroke. And let me just move my screen slightly so we can see these options better. So the dash at the moment is set to 12 points. But if I click here and I use the up and down arrows on my keyboard, I can very quickly increase the dash. I can also press up and down arrows to much faster increase it. And let's say I want to use 30-point dashes, but then I would like to also make sure that the gaps are not the same size, because by default the dash and the gap will be exactly the same size, but once you add a gap size, you can customize that as well. So I just use the up and down arrows again to customize that. You can even add more dashes and gaps and create a more complex pattern, but for now I'm just going to keep it as is. Once you have a dashed line with gaps, you can also make use of the cap feature, and I'm going to switch to round cap and maybe increase the gap size just so we can see these round caps. So what happens is that the caps of the dashes will be rounded. The same thing would apply to the line here, and what I can do actually is to select that line, and using the eyedropper tool, I can sample the same settings that I used on this circle. So once I click on it, you will see it will pick up both the fill color and the stroke with all its attributes. And of course, we can't see the fill because this is just a line. But if I do the same thing with this square here and use the eyedropper tool again. By the way, the shortcut for that is I, easy to remember. I can just click on it, and once again, it will be applied. Now, with the square, we also have another option which is very useful. Going back to the stroke settings, when you use dashed line, you can use two different versions of that. You can align the dashes to the corners of the shape. That means it's going to adjust the length of the dashes, so it becomes a little bit more organized. Or we can go back to this one, where it's not really following the shape itself. So once again, the difference between the two ways of aligning the dashes around the shape. In case of the square, we can also use another useful option called corner. Now, at the moment, you can see here on the corners, we have sharp angles. But if I choose the round join, then these corners will be rounded. If I increase the weight of my stroke, it becomes even more visible. So that was the original corner, and this is the round corner. You could also use bevel join, which is going to trim them at the corner points. Let me just reduce the size of the stroke and set it back to round join. And let me select the line that we created. What I would like to do with this is to use arrowheads on it. That's another stroke setting that you can apply. Now you can decide what type of arrowhead you wish to use on each side. Let's just start with maybe something like this. And then on the other end, I would like to have an arrow like that. Now, as you can see, because my stroke weight is quite thick, these arrowheads are extremely big. That is because each of them has a scale value underneath them. So if you don't want to change the weight of your stroke, you can reduce the size or scale of these arrowheads. And once again, you can use the shift key to make it smaller. Let's just make it, let's say 20% or maybe 30%. And now I can just type in the same thing here on the right, so 30, and press enter. Now that might be a little bit too small, so I'm going to increase it slightly. That can be maybe 50%. You can also decide whether you want to align the arrowheads at the end of your stroke or extend the arrow tip beyond the end of the path. Now for this instance, I'm going to turn off the dash line, and that way we get a solid line. There is also a useful option here. If you ever want to swap the beginning and end points, you just have to click on this icon here. So that's also very simple. And the great thing about lines is that you can always increase their length, and of course you can move each point in different directions. There is one last thing I would like to show you, and that is the width tool and the profile option, for which I'm going to create another shape. So let me just draw another ellipse, which is going to remember the colors that we used earlier, apart from all these special settings on the strokes. But I want to keep it as it is, and instead I am going to change the profile of this stroke. Now this is again something you can do from the stroke panel. Here at the bottom you will find the profiles. So let's see what happens if we choose the first one. This is going to vary the width of the stroke. Although it's set to 20 points, it's going to keep it at 20 at one point, but it will reduce it completely down to 0 on the other side of the shape. Let's just see what happens if we select another one, maybe this one here. Again, it's going to apply the profile along the stroke around this object. When we have a non-symmetrical profile, we can also flip it along the stroke, so to flip the direction of it. And of course, we can control the size of it with the weight. That still is the way that you can affect the size of the stroke. And you can make the profile even more custom if you switch back to uniform stroke and use a tool called the width tool. This is how it looks, and Shift W is the shortcut if you want to access it quickly. With this tool, you can just click and drag at a certain point to increase the size of the stroke, and maybe at another point reduce the size of the stroke. Once again, I can do the same thing at another point, and so on and so forth. You can see how you can very quickly build up different widths at certain points along the shape. You can always go back to these points and even move them around along the shape, or you can select the endpoints and increase or decrease their size. If you double click on the center of a width point, you can also get the measurements of it. So if you want to copy the measurements from it, you can do that. Or you can also change the sides of it individually. So if I type in, let's say 12 on one of these sides, and I will click on OK, you will see now it increased only one side while keeping the other one the same. You can also do this with a shortcut. Holding down the Alt key, you can drag individual sides of the width instead of changing them all at the same time. So once again, here if I hold down Alt key, I can change it individually. While I have this shape selected, this width profile is actually already visible here in this preview, but it can also be saved by clicking on the Add to Profiles icon. That way, I will be able to use this later on. So for example, if I select this shape here and choose that profile that we saved, it will be applied to that. And even using the dashed lines, it will still work. And let me just show you one more example of the width tool. When I use the star tool, and I will click here in the middle and drag it out and repeat the same thing on all of these points. And you will see how quickly we change the way this shape looks like. So applying this variable width on each edge individually could create already something like a flower. If I select this shape and copy it, I can go up to copy from the edit menu or Command C or Control C, and then remember Control F or Command F is to paste it back again. I can hold down the Shift key to make it smaller, and also hold down the Alt or Option key to still keep it centered while I'm resizing. That's another great shortcut to learn. So Alt held down or Option key held down will make sure that you resize and keep the object in the same center point. So resizing it once again, maybe slightly further down, I can have another part using the same technique, maybe rotate it around a bit, and you can already see what I mean, that it starts to look like a flower. So as you can see, there's many different techniques you can do with strokes, and we are definitely going to talk more about them once we get to the appearance panel that we already prepared here on the bottom right. That is something we will discuss in this chapter. But for now, in the next video, we are going to talk about color swatches. Choosing the right colors for your design is very important. Luckily, Adobe Illustrator offers plenty of features to find the right colors and apply them to your designs. I already mentioned in the previous videos that you can access swatches and also colors from the options bar, but of course these both have their own panels. So you can find the color panel here with its options from the panel menu, and you can also find swatches in the swatches panel. Again, it has its own options here. In this video, I'm going to explain in more detail how to work with color swatches, and we will also have a look at color themes and the Adobe Color website. So first of all, what's the main use of a swatch? Well, technically, it's a way you can save a color that you can then use later in elements in your designs. So let's just say in this design, we want to use the same color for the umbrella as what we use on the sunglasses. The easiest way to make sure that we do that is by using the direct selection tool and selecting the actual object, which already has that color that we want to use. Now, if I go to the swatches panel and I click on the new swatch icon, it will automatically save that currently selected color. I can decide whether I want this to be a CMYK color or RGB, and I can also decide what name I wish to use for it. I can use the values here in the name, or I can type in something like key color. When you save a color swatch, there's also two very important options that you need to decide. Whether this is going to be a global color, and also whether you want to add this to a library or not. Now, for this first color, I'm going to turn off the library option, and I will also not have the global option selected. Let's see what happens if we save it like this. So I'm going to click OK, and we will see that the color swatch appeared here in the swatches panel. To separate it more from the default swatches, we can also click now on this new color group option, which will put the currently selected swatch into a separate group. And instead of selected artwork, I'm going to choose selected swatches. Then I will click OK. And you can see now it moved that swatch into this new group here at the bottom. If I want to apply this color to this first letter, for example, I can very easily do that by just selecting that letter and then applying the swatch from the swatches panel. Let's try to save another swatch now, but by using a slightly different method. So I'm going to select one of these colors here, this bright green, almost mint color, and I will click on the new color option. Once again, I can decide how I want to save it. Let's just save it as CMYK, and then I will also decide to have this set up as a global color. When I click OK, I can then move this into that color group that we created, and already you can see the difference that a normal color looks like this, while a global color swatch has that little white triangle on the bottom right corner. So let's see what that means. If I now select another part of the text, like this T here at the bottom, and then apply that color on it, I can then also select these palm trees here and apply the same color on it. Now, if I make any changes to this color swatch, it will apply on every element where it was used in the design. That's why it's called global color. So let's see what's the difference. If I double click on this color swatch, I can get to make changes to it, and having the preview option on, I will be able to see it already in the design in the background. So when I make a change, you will see how it immediately updates on both instances, even though I don't have them selected. That is once again because it's a global color swatch. I won't make this change, I will keep it as is, but I'm going to double click now on the other color swatch, have the preview turned on, and let's see if anything happens to the colors in the design. You can see I can make changes to the swatch without affecting the actual design in the background. Both of these options are useful. Now, last but not least, what's the add to my library option? Let's say I want to save that color from the original title as a swatch, but on top of that, I also want to save it into my libraries. So I'm going to click on new color swatch, just like before. I could decide that this is a global swatch as well, and I can also make sure this is also CMYK. But then I can also turn on the add to my library option, and I can also decide which library I wish to save this into. Let's just stick to the vector element. So I'm going to click on that, and then I will click OK. So now it's not only saved in my swatches, just to show you it's there, and I can also again put it into this group, but it's also saved in this library, which is a great feature once again, because this library can even be shared easily with other Creative Cloud users. So if I do collaborations, that's a quick and easy way to share the swatches that I used in a design. Remember, the libraries panel is the one that we used in the very beginning of the course, where we imported some assets from the Creative Cloud market. You can use the libraries panel to apply colors, as you can see, but of course you can also go to your swatches and apply a color from there very quickly and easily. Now, what if you want to quickly save all the swatches used in a design and put them into the swatches panel? Well, what you can do is to press Command A or Control A to select everything in your design. Make sure that nothing is locked that you want to include in the swatches. And then when you click on the new color group here, you will be able to choose selected artwork, and you can even turn all of the color swatches into global colors, and then click OK. With that, you will get a new set of colors, and these are all the colors used in this design. So we can try to amend one of these colors. I clicked outside, so I deselected everything, and then I double click on this color here. Let's turn on preview and see what happens when we change it. We can see it clearly which are the colors that I'm currently changing. So once again, this was a way to quickly import all the colors from the artwork into my swatches panel. The same way I can also, of course, remove swatches that I don't need anymore. So if I click on this color here and shift click on the top color there, I can then click on the trash can and delete these swatches. If you want to reuse colors from a document later on in another project, you can also export your swatches and it will create a swatch file. So you can do that from the panel menu and choosing Save Swatch Library as ASE or AI. The advantage of the ASE, which is the Adobe Swatch Exchange format, is that it can also be used in Photoshop and InDesign. So if I choose that one, I just need to decide where I want to save it. And I'm going to save it into the same folder that I have all the other elements. As you can see, the file format is ASE. So once I click on that, there's just a warning here that if there's any gradient or pattern swatches or even tints, they are not going to be visible in other applications only in Illustrator. So Photoshop and InDesign won't be able to read those special swatches, but these swatches should be all fine. So I can click OK, and that means now these are all saved. It's worth mentioning that there are many color libraries which you can access from this icon here at the bottom, and you can easily find color books as well, which are the Pantone colors or spot colors most commonly used in design. So if I choose, for example, Pantone CMYK Coated or Solid Coated, I will get a separate panel with all these swatches inside. Now these have all names or codes, so you can also search for them. Let's say if I type in 785, I will get this nice color, and as soon as I select it, it will be added to my swatches panel. Now we can select something in the design like this letter and apply that color to it. When I double click on this color, it will tell me that this is the Pantone 1785C color, and it's automatically set to a spot color. And in this case, the color mode is set to book color. The difference between a process color and a spot color is that while the process colors are created from the CMYK inks, a mixture of them, the spot color is a pre-mixed ink, which has to be purchased to be able to print it. So let me show the difference. When I switch back and double click on a process color, we will always see the colors that is needed to make that color. Because I'm currently in RGB mode, it shows the RGB values, but we can also see them in CMYK colors. Spot colors are used mainly for logos and branding, but they are also very important on packaging designs where you have to maintain a consistent color for certain elements. And last but not least, let me show you what color themes can do. It's a separate panel where you will see your saved color themes. Now for this, again, you have to have an Adobe ID, and then you will be able to use this website called Adobe Color CC, where you can also log in with your same Adobe ID that you use for Creative Cloud subscription. And here you can quickly create color harmonies just by randomly moving these points around, or you can go into explore mode and find color harmonies that you might want to work with. Let's say I really like this one here, so I'm going to choose save. I will choose which library I want to save it into. We can save it into vector elements, and we can call it something else, but for now I'm just going to keep it as is. And once I click on save, we can also check it here in the website, so we can see it exactly how this looks. But once I go back to Illustrator, within the libraries, I will see that color theme showing up straight away. From the libraries, you can just right click and choose Add to Swatches, which will appear in swatches again as a separate group. And here's a brilliant feature which I'm going to talk more about later on. It's called Recolor Artwork, but I just want to show it to you because it really works nicely together with color groups from your swatches panel. So what you can do is to select the whole artwork, which is Command or Control A, and then here in the options bar, click on the Recolor Artwork option. So I will click on that. Then it shows me all the colors that currently is used in this artwork. But then here on the right, we can also see our color groups. And there's the color theme we just saved from Adobe Color website. And if I click on this, then all the colors in the design will be updated and it will use only these few colors that we have in that theme. Illustrator will try to replicate the design as close as possible to the original look, but at the same time completely recoloring it. So let's see this before and after. I'm just going to close everything and go back one step. Will show us the original and then go to after, where we apply that color theme. As I mentioned, this Recolor Artwork is a very useful feature, but we will talk a lot more about it because it's a very robust and complex technique, and I don't want to be carried away. So all we wanted to go through here was the swatches and how to work with them. But you might remember that I mentioned that there can be gradient swatches as well. So that's exactly what I'm going to talk about in the next video, how to create gradients and save them as swatches. Working with gradients in Illustrator is great fun because there's so many ways you can use them, and it's very easy to edit and save them as well. Let me select the background in this illustration, and instead of having this flat mint color, I would like to introduce a nice subtle gradient here. Now, to make it easier to see what's happening, first I'm going to turn off the design elements and we will just see this rectangle on its own. Now there's two different ways you can apply a gradient, actually even more, but these are the two ways that I normally use. You can go to the gradient panel and you can apply a gradient from here. You can pick one of the default gradients, or you can also just click on the slider. That's one of the ways you can start with a gradient. You can also use the gradient tool, which we will come back to. That's G on the keyboard if you want to quickly access it, by the way. And the gradient tool will be very handy. But you can also apply gradients from the swatches. Here you can also find a couple of default gradients you can choose from. But let's stick to the most basic one, the black and white linear gradient. Once this is selected, I go back to the gradient panel and we can see the options available for us. First of all, what we can do is to decide how this gradient should be applied on this shape. Whether we want it linear or radial. Radial looks like this and linear looks like that. No matter what type of gradient you use, you can always reverse the gradient, so change the direction very quickly. But let's just stick to white to black at the moment. Now, the transition from white to black can be controlled with this center point, and that is almost like balancing how much color you want to use, so a bit more of the white or a bit more of the black. That's the midpoint of the transition between these two color stops. They call them color stops, and they can be also changed. You can also call them sliders. So if we double click on it, we can pick a color, and then we can double click on the other one and we can pick another color. Now once again, changing the center point or midpoint can change how much of each color is going to be used in this gradient. And of course, even these sliders can be moved around easily. Below this slider, you can see the exact location of each of these color stops. So there's a percentage there, but you can also control the opacity. So if I reduce it, it will become more see-through. Currently, we are just seeing the white artboard, but it's actually a see-through gradient. And just to prove that to you, if I drag it further up, you can see how it fades into the gray background. I will just undo this, and I will undo the change on opacity as well. Just remember, it's something you can also do to change the opacity of each of the color stops. But the same way as you move the currently available stops, you can also click under the slider to add a new color stop. And by default, it's going to be using exactly the same shade that currently was there in the transition. But then once I double click on it, I can change that also to something else. You can have as many color stops as you want in one gradient. And once you have the colors roughly that you wish to use, I would recommend to switch to the gradient tool, because the rest of the features are easier to use with that. Instead of changing the angle in the gradient panel, what you can do is to click and drag to change the direction and the spread of your gradient. So when you drag just a short line, it's going to be a very abrupt transition. When you stretch it out further, then it's going to be a much smoother gradient. You can of course go beyond the actual shape and in any different angles. And similarly, when you use radial gradients, you will have the same effect, but in a circular way. So in this case, you actually define the radius of your gradient. So you can decide where you want to start it and how far you want to spread it out. With radial gradients, we have an additional option, and that is the aspect ratio. So currently it's a perfect circle, but it can be squeezed into more of an elliptical shape. Now there's a very important thing that you need to remember. If the object you are currently working on is within a group, you can't actually see the gradient annotator tool, which is very useful. So if that ever happens to you, you have to make sure from the layers you select the path itself on which you are applying the gradient and not the group. Once the path is selected, as you can see, also don't forget, don't click on the name, click on the little circle next to it. That's how you highlight an object. So once you have the individual object selected, you will not only see the gradient, but also this thing called gradient annotator tool. By the way, it can also be hidden. So if you can't see it, maybe it's because it's hidden. From the view menu, you can find it here, gradient annotator, and there's even a shortcut for showing and hiding it. Now, let's just say now we can see it finally. So what can we do with it? Well, first of all, we can very easily reposition it. So instead of redrawing it, I can move it around. In case of a radial gradient, we can squeeze it. So change the aspect ratio of it, just like that. We can also resize it very quickly, make it smaller or bigger. And of course, we can adjust the color stops as well on it. And that's probably the best thing about using this annotator. So we can do it directly on the object itself. Even the midpoints can be adjusted. Plus, you can also double click and change the actual colors. You can, of course, also add new color stops on the annotator and then change the color there. If you don't want to use a color stop anymore, you can just drag it away from the annotator. The same thing applies here as well. If you have a color stop that you don't need anymore, just drag it down. And then let me switch to the linear gradient, where you will see again the same thing. So you have your annotator and you can see all the color stops on it. And of course, you can change the size of the gradient. If you go slightly away from the annotator, you can also change the angle of it very quickly. I just prefer to redraw it, to be honest, in case of a linear gradient. Now, once you have a gradient created that you wish to use, you can also save it as a swatch. And all you have to do is to go to the swatches panel and simply click on the new icon. That's going to create the new gradient swatch. So let me turn back the design that we have here. Now, if I want, I can always switch back to the original color or something similar and then check how it looks with the gradient. And then, of course, I can keep using the gradient tool, so I can create a different transition from top to bottom or from bottom to top and so on and so forth. So there's many different things you can do once you set up the gradient. Now, there's one last thing I would like to mention, and that is you can also use gradients on strokes. Now, just to prove this to you, I'm going to create a circle quickly here. And instead of using a gradient on the fill of this, I'm going to swap the gradient onto the stroke attribute. If you remember, that's the Shift X shortcut. And I'm going to hold down Shift and increase the size of this stroke. So now we can see it being applied here. And to make it easier to see it, I'm just going to drag it away from the actual design itself. So there you go, we have our gradient on the stroke. And in these cases, when the stroke attribute is selected, here in the gradient panel, you can also control how you want the gradient to be applied. And you can see we have 3 different options. The first one is going to apply the gradient as if the stroke was actually an object. But in these cases, the gradient tool can't be used to change the direction. So you will have to use the angle from the panel. And you won't be able to stretch the gradient beyond the actual boundaries of the object. So it's a little bit more constrained than using a gradient on the fill attribute. But we have 2 other options as well. We have the apply gradient along the stroke, where there will be a visible start and end point. And then there's the third one as well, where the gradient is going to be applied from center out or from the outside in, depending on how you look at it. So this is what we call across the stroke. The first one was within the stroke, and the second one in the middle is called along the stroke. So let's just see these side by side, just so it's a little bit easier to memorize. I'm going to create 3 versions, and I will apply them in the order we have it here in the gradient panel. So that is within stroke, the second is along stroke, and the third one is across the stroke. And I'm going to increase the stroke a little bit even more, just so we can have a really good look at it. And you can imagine that there's a lot of possibilities once you start working with gradients. We are going to keep using them in the following chapters, but in the next video, we will talk about a very important panel, the appearance panel, where we can not only keep track of all the changes to the appearance of objects, but also create much more complex combinations of using multiple strokes and fills and even effects. In this video, I'm going to talk about the appearance panel. You might remember it, we placed it here on the right side in an earlier chapter, and I promise to you that it's going to be a very useful panel. That's exactly what I'm going to prove to you this time. So at first, it might seem like an unnecessary duplication of all the settings that you have from the options bar, but actually the appearance panel can do a lot more than that. Let's just try it with a simple shape. So I'm going to create a square just to start with. And you will see here in the appearance panel that we have the fill color available, which we can change easily. And we can also apply a stroke color, just like that, and also increase the size of it. Let me move this shape closer so we can keep an eye on both of these parts at the same time. That's not much new because we've already been able to do this before. But what's the whole point of the appearance panel is that you can have multiple strokes and fills on the same shape. And that's when it becomes important to keep an eye on this panel. So let's give it quickly a second stroke. That's the option here at the bottom, add new stroke. So the first icon there. And as soon as I change the color and change the size of it, we should be able to see both strokes. Why don't I see the other stroke right now? Well, it is because there is an order between these attributes, and whatever is on top is closest to you. So if I move this one, which is a bigger stroke, underneath the other one, we should be able to see both of them at the same time. Let me just make this even bigger and maybe change the color of it to something that's obviously different. So now if we have a look at this shape, we can see that we have 2 strokes and 1 fill color on it. I would be able to continue doing the same thing. Again, I'm going to create another stroke, maybe set this one up to white, and let's just reduce the size of it slightly. So now we actually have 3 strokes and 1 fill. But we could even have multiple fills. So let me select the fill and click on this new fill icon here at the bottom. That will add an additional fill color. And why not use a gradient? Let's use this black and white gradient. And while we are at it, I would like to show you also that you can change not only what swatch you want to use on a fill color or on a stroke, but also you can amend the opacity of it. So if you click on opacity, you can control how strong that will be, but you can also change the blend mode. And I'm just going to choose multiply, which will blend the gradient, the black and white gradient, onto the color that was used underneath, which is this blue color. So let's just recap. Now we have 3 strokes and 2 fills. The best thing about the appearance panel is that we can turn these strokes one by one on and off, and also the fill colors can be turned on and off. So all of these attributes are making up the appearance of this object. Every attribute is editable, and you can even change the order of them. So for example, if I want, I can drag this black stroke on top, which then will cover all the other strokes because that's the biggest one. But as soon as I make it smaller, so let me just go down in size, maybe down to 3, then immediately the order of the strokes changed. It is important to remember to keep the object selected on which you are working. If the appearance panel says no selection here on the top, that means you currently don't have anything selected. So it doesn't matter what you change on these values, it won't update on the object. You have to make sure the object selected, and then it should say something else apart from no selection, like path or group, and so on and so forth. Coming back to the second field that I added, when you open up the actual attribute, you can see that it's using a multiply blend mode. Now this is something I just quickly applied, but let me show this once again to you. We have the normal mode, which is the default option, and then we have all these other blend modes here, out of which I most of the time use multiply, which really nicely blends the current colors onto the color underneath. So look at this. If I change the color underneath, that gradient is still going to be visible on top of this. Now once you set up an appearance that you might want to use again on another object, you can save it as a graphic style, what you will find here in this panel. And all you have to do is, while the object is selected, click on this new graphic style icon. That will save it. And then whatever you add, let's just add maybe a star shape, we will be able to apply that graphic style on it straight away, as easily as that. When you look at the graphic styles panel, and let me just drag this out for a bit, just so we can see it better. So looking at this, we will be able to choose a couple of default graphic styles, like that one called Bevel Soft. We can also find Dusk, which is a quite nice one. And then we have also these other graphic styles that are using patterns. That's not all the default options that you can choose from, because here in the libraries we can find sets of other graphic styles as well. Like, let's try the Illuminate styles and pick one of these. Once you select a style, it will be added into your graphic styles library. And the best thing about them is that once you use a graphic style, you can actually see all those attributes that makes up the appearance here in the appearance panel. So we can find all the fill colors and also all the strokes that they used for this design. It is almost like a way to reverse engineer how they actually created a certain style. Let me switch back to the way we created our style, and let me show you one additional feature. I am going to select the black stroke which is on top, and I will show you another great technique that again is best done through the appearance panel. Here at the bottom we have an FX icon. These are all the effects from which you can choose any, but for now I'm just going to start with a simple one. Under Stylize, I will choose Scribble. This is an Illustrator effect, and once I turn on preview, you will see it already being used here. But let's just increase the variation a bit just so we can see how it works. Maybe the curviness as well, the path overlap, something like that. Increase spacing slightly just so it's more visible. And when I click OK, you will see that now, if I zoom closer, this shape is not the way it used to look, because now that stroke has an effect on it as well. When I open up the stroke attribute, I can see that scribble effect inside. I can turn it off, turn it back on, and I can also click on it to bring up the options that I had. These effects are called dynamic effects or live effects, which means that they can always be changed and updated. You can even swap the effect between the strokes. So if I open all the 3 strokes I have, I can drag this scribble effect onto the red stroke or again onto the white stroke, and so on and so forth. I could also copy the effect by holding down the Alt key and dragging it over to another attribute. Now I have the same effect on both of these strokes, the black and the red one as well. So now that we know how it works, let's put this to use. And I'm going to create a new graphic style. What I will build is a style that I can use to draw roads. I'm going to just put this star on the side, maybe even out of the artboard. That's what I do sometimes when I want to clear up my artboard. But I'm not sure whether I need an object or not. I just put it on the side. You can of course draw anything outside of your artboard. The only disadvantage of that is that you won't be able to export those elements. But coming back here, I am going to use the line tool and just draw a straight line holding down the shift key. Now I am going to add another stroke, and I will change the stroke color to a darker gray value, something like that. I will also increase the size of that, and then I will change the stroke in the middle to orange. I will also increase the size slightly, and then before I do anything else, let me just move this closer so we can see it better. So once I increase the stroke size, I can now click on the stroke value and choose dashed line. Maybe I reduce the size slightly, and I will also change the gap size to something a little bit less than that, what we can see currently. And also I will reduce the dash size, something like that. Maybe the gap can be a little bit more. Okay, that looks quite good, but let's add another stroke again. So the third stroke value at the bottom, I'm going to increase slightly again, and I will also change the color on it, maybe to red. Or let's just use a brighter gray, something like that. Let's increase it a little bit further up. All right, now we have this design ready, which can be used easily to draw roads, right? So we have 3 strokes only. That's the only thing I did here. We have the center line, we have the stroke, which is the actual concrete, and then we have a pavement or something similar to that. But currently, it's still not really convincing. I mean, I think I can do this even better. So let's just put this here on the side, and let's just add a little bit more finesse or refinement to this. Let's select the stroke at the bottom and increase the size of it. So let's just increase that pavement a bit more. Then I'm going to add another stroke on top of that, and I will make it maybe completely dark or much darker than the previous one. I will keep it the same size, but I'm going to use dashed line on it, and I'm going to remove the gap first of all, and I'm going to increase or actually decrease the dashes. So something very narrow, like 1 point. Then I can add a much longer gap, something like that, and immediately it starts to look like tiles on the sidewalk. Let me reduce the size of the center line a bit, and instead I will also add lines on the sides of the road. For that I am going to click on new stroke, and I will increase the size of it close to the size of the actual concrete, like that. I will also remove the dash line from it, and then I just move it underneath the other stroke. Now all I need to do is to just reduce slightly the size of the actual pavement color, and immediately we have also paint on the edges of the concrete. I can also make the color of this white, and if I want it to be very precise, I could even add another stroke, move it behind this white stroke, and increase the size of that slightly beyond the white stroke. So we have also an extra line there next to it. The line in the middle needs to be slightly brighter than this. So I shift click on the color and increase the brightness of it a bit. Around there, I think that looks a little bit better. And now we can save this as a graphic style. So remember, all you need to do is to save it as a graphic style, which you can do here in this panel, and click on New Graphic Style. Now that is great, it's now saved. So we can even delete this object and the star as well, we don't need them anymore. Let's come back to the artboard and let me show you what I prepared here. I'm going to turn on these two layers and voila, there's a little city. Now we just need roads. You have this exercise file, so you can build your own streets once you create this same graphic style that I just showed you. And I would recommend to use the following tool. There is a tool here called Pencil tool. The shortcut for it is N. And we are going to learn more about this in the next chapter. But for now, all I want you to do is to draw a line with that tool. Once you have your line, you will be able to apply the graphic style. Just choose the one that we saved, and there you go, there's the street. The good thing about the pencil tool is that it can be set up in a way that you can continue drawing existing shapes. As you can see, I can draw over this road a couple of times until it gets into the direction that I wanted it to work with. So I'm just going to continue drawing it, and there it's going to go through. Then I can start another road, and once again just choose the graphic style that we used earlier. You can have always turns in the streets, and you can even overlap them on each other, just like that. If you want to make sure that your pencil works the same way as it does on my computer, you just have to double click on it and make sure that you have the edit selected paths and keep selected options enabled. As I said, I will come back to these features later and I will explain it in more detail. But for now, we can have a look at our city that we designed and enjoy how quickly we can continue adding more streets, again, just using the graphic style and the pencil tool. Once again, I can just move this slightly away, just like that. In this video, I'm going to talk about how to work with effects in Illustrator. In the previous video, I already mentioned that we can apply them through the appearance panel, but it's also good to know that there is actually a separate menu called Effect. Now within here, we can see that there's two main categories, Illustrator effects and Photoshop effects. All you have to really remember is while Illustrator effects are fully vector-based, Photoshop effects are always pixel-based. We call them raster effects. There's one important thing to remember about raster effects. So let me just copy this element here down, and I'm going to make sure it's grouped together. So I just press Command G or Control G on PC. And then from the effect menu, I'm going to go to Blur, Gaussian Blur. So this is a Photoshop effect, which means it's going to be raster effect. And I'm going to apply a blur on this object, just like that. When I zoom closer, we can have a closer look at it. And after a while, it will become obvious that there are some pixels involved in this effect. Now, the raster effect settings is what's important in these cases, because although this object is still vector-based, to be able to render this effect, Illustrator needs to rely on pixels. If you go into the effect menu, you can find the document raster effect settings, where you can decide how well defined you want these effects to be. The higher the resolution, the more computing power Illustrator will need. So let's see what happens if I set it up all the way to high, which is 300 ppi, and I click OK. Immediately, the blurred details will get really nice and smooth. What I recommend to do is to set it to 72 while you are working, which is the screen standard resolution. And then if you feel like you need to add more definition, you can increase it higher. The document raster effect settings is obviously a global option, so it will apply to the whole document. And if you use a lot of raster effects, you might want to remind yourself before you export your final file to increase the raster effect settings and ensure that you will get a good quality print. It's also important to notice that once you apply an effect on a group or an object, it will be indicated with a filled circle next to that element in the layers panel. So empty circle means that you only have fill colors and strokes, but once you have multiple attributes or effects, you will see that the complexity is represented with this filled circle. Also, don't forget that whenever you apply effects, they can always be found in the appearance panel. So I can always turn it off or back on, and I can also click on it to amend the amount of blur in this case. Let me show you now a vector-based effect. So I'm going to select this other instance of this little icon. I'm going to group it together as well and go through the effect menu, but this time I'm going to choose distort, roughen. This is a great effect as well, which you can remember even as an explosion effect, because that's what is going to happen once I turn on preview. You can see that it's going to blow this icon into pieces, and that can be controlled, of course, so the size you can play around with, but you can also increase the detail level. Now this makes it really interesting. So if I have a low amount of size but high amount of detail, I can use it to have a little bit more of a fuzzy edge on the design. Now if we have a look at the layers panel again, we can see the full circle represents that there's something more complex than just the default appearance, and there's the roughen effect there. Although I grouped that circle and the fire together, I can still access parts of the group, and I can apply an effect directly to a part of the group, like in this case, that circle. So the circle has that roughen feature on it already, but on top of that, I'm going to add another effect, go through the stylize, scribble option, and I can again change spacing on this maybe, and then maybe also reduce curviness a bit, something like that. We can also reduce variation, and then I will click OK. So now we have multiple effects, and I managed to turn this whole thing more into like a sketch or hand drawing. So my point is, feel free to combine effects and apply them to different parts of your design. Here's another example. What if I select this circle? The map is not part of this selection, just the circle in this case, and I'm going to apply a white stroke around it. Now, you might be wondering, why do I use a white stroke? Well, it's not visible really because it's on a white background, but once I go into the effect menu and choose stylize, drop shadow, it will become visible. Let me just turn on the preview and we can already see it there. I might just reduce the blur a bit, something like that, and also reduce the distance to 1. Once I click OK, we can already see how it looks like. Now, currently, the drop shadow is applied on the whole circle, not just the stroke. So what happens if I drag the drop shadow effect here in the appearance panel and drop it into the stroke attribute? When I do that, you can see what happened is that now the drop shadow is only on the stroke but not on the fill. So the stroke itself is actually casting a shadow on the circle's fill color. So once again, what happened was that I moved the drop shadow, and I could do the same and drag it onto the fill color, or just drag it all the way down so it's affecting both attributes. And that's another important lesson there, to learn that if you want to affect both fill and stroke or all the attributes on an object, make sure you drag the effect all the way at the bottom, which is going to be like a global effect applied to all the attributes. I actually prefer it if it's only on the stroke in this case, so that's where I'm going to move it into. And here's another very important thing that you need to remember. If you want to apply an effect on multiple objects, you have to make sure you group them together first. This is especially important if you want to use 3D effects. So I selected these two items and I press Command or Control G. Now they are a group. And now I can go into Effect, 3D, Extrude and Bevel. This is a brilliant option as well. And once I click on Preview, you can see exactly what happens, that now we have a 3D object. And I can turn this around and see it from different angles. When I click OK, I can see how it turned out. And yes, it looks more like a coin. And I can always go back and make changes to how it's positioned in the 3D space. And let's not forget that all the effects that you use in Illustrator can be saved as a graphic style. So I could save this 3D effect, for example, which is now added there. And then I could apply to another group, like this one here on the left. So if I select these and I choose graphic style, we can see how that will work in 3D. It probably looked better without the 3D effect, so I can always undo that last step. But it's just good to know that you can combine effects together and you can always update them using the appearance panel. Of course, we would be able to spend hours and hours about going through all these effects, and there's actually no limit of how you can combine them together. So instead of spending time on that, I would like to ask you to experiment with the effects. But there's one last thing that I would like to explain to you, and that is the Expand Appearance option. So what I'm going to do here is I select this circle, which has this drop shadow effect on it, and I will come to the object menu and show you what Expand Appearance does. When I click on that, what happens is, at the moment, not really obvious because it looks exactly the same as it was. But once I look at the layers, I will find that within this group now I have an additional group, which is the actual shadow itself and that outline. If I go further into it, I can see actually the stroke and the shadow are two separate objects now. So Expand Appearance extracts all the necessary elements, so you lose the ability to make changes to them, so they are not dynamic effects anymore, but they can be edited manually. Which means, for example, I can select the shadow and just use the arrows on the keyboard to position it differently. This is another great technique whenever you want to extend what you can already do with effects. And you can see how different immediately it looks. It's not the standard shadow that normally you see in designs. It looks even more 3D now. And because the shadow is a separate object, I could even distort it like that. So we can call Expand Appearance a destructive technique because it separates the effect from the object. But remember that it opens up new ways to work with the effects. And that is all I wanted to explain to you in this chapter. But like last time, at the end of the chapter, I have an additional video where I'm going to give you some tasks to practice what we've learned this time. To practice what we learned in these last few videos. To practice what we learned in this chapter, I would like you to open this exercise and play around applying effects and graphic styles on each of these words. You will be able to select them individually, so each word is a compound path. I set these up already for you. Of course, you can change their color, you can apply strokes on them, and I would like you to play around with the effects. Not just the one that I showed you, but all the other effects you can find here. I just warn you that there's many of them, and you can get completely different results by combining them in different ways. So don't stress about it, keep calm and play around with them. And the other thing I would like you to do is, once you are ready with the styles, to unlock the gradient background layer, select that square in the background, and create a nice gradient on it. Instead of walking you through how I would do this, I'm just going to try to inspire you a bit, and I will speed it up the way I'm going to apply effects and create the gradient in the background. So have fun, and then see you in the next chapter when we will learn about drawing techniques and tools.